Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat. So you know those times when you just feel like you're drowning in challenging behaviors?
Oh, yeah.
You're trying every trick in the book, but nothing seems to work.
Totally.
Well, today, we're throwing you a lifeline.
Right.
We're going deep on 3 powerful methods to decrease those unwanted behaviors. We've got extinction, correcting,
Right.
and differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, or DRA.
The DRA, yeah.
Now, each of these methods has its strengths and weaknesses.
Oh, for sure.
Knowing which one to use is like having the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
You wouldn't use a hammer for everything.
You got it.
So let's start with extinction. Now, you might be thinking,
Yeah.
I know extinction, just ignore the behavior.
Right.
But it's actually a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it is.
Extinction is about really understanding what's reinforcing that unwanted behavior and then withholding that specific reinforcement.
Absolutely.
This is where things get really interesting.
It does.
Because when you first start using extinction, you might see what's called an extinction burst.
Right.
And that's where the behavior actually gets worse before it gets better.
It can definitely feel that way.
Imagine you're used to getting a candy bar from the vending machine, but all of a sudden it stops working.
Oh, yeah.
You might press the button a few more times.
Totally.
Even try shaking the machine. She's like, give me my candy bar.
Out of frustration, for sure.
Ugh, those extinction bursts are so tough to handle in the moment, even when you know they're supposed to happen.
Definitely.
So, any advice on how we can handle those extinction bursts without accidentally rewarding the unwanted behavior?
Well, the key is to have a plan.
A plan.
Yeah, anticipate that burst
Yeah.
and decide in advance how you're going to respond. And remember, when you see that burst, it's actually a good sign.
Okay.
It means your strategy is working, but you must stay consistent.
Got it. So it's like those pesky weeds that keep popping back up in your garden. You got to keep pulling them out even when it feels like they're multiplying overnight.
But what about those behaviors that are dangerous or harmful?
Right.
We can't just sit back and wait for extinction to work in those situations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's where our second method, correcting, comes into play. Now, before we dive into specifics,
Okay.
it's important to remember that correcting, which sometimes involves punishment or penalties, should only be used when absolutely necessary.
Right.
Our primary focus as ABA professionals should always be on teaching and reinforcing those positive behaviors.
Absolutely. So when would correcting be warranted? What are those situations where it might be the most appropriate approach?
So think about behaviors that pose a serious risk, either to the individual or to others. For example, if someone is about to walk into traffic
Oh, yeah.
or put their hand on a hot stove, you need to intervene immediately to prevent harm.
That's a no-brainer. What about less extreme situations, though? Like, let's say an employee who's constantly late or missing deadlines.
In those cases, you'd want to exhaust other options first.
Like providing really clear expectations, offering support, and using positive reinforcement for on-time performance. But if those strategies aren't working and the behavior is significantly impacting the team or the organization, well, then correcting might be necessary.
Okay, so we've established when correcting might be appropriate.
Yeah.
But how do we actually go about it effectively?
Right.
Our source material provides a whole list of key points to remember.
Yeah, and I think for our audience of experienced ABA professionals, we can probably focus on the most impactful ones.
Okay.
Let's start with being specific.
Why?
When you're correcting someone, clearly pinpoint the exact behavior that needs to change and what the desired behavior actually looks like.
It's like that old adage, measure twice, cut once.
Right.
You want to be precise with your feedback so there's no room for misinterpretation.
Exactly. And data can play a huge role here.
Data.
Use data to illustrate the problem and track progress. It's like holding up a mirror, showing the person the objective reality of their actions and the impact they're having.
Data can also be really helpful in confirming whether a consequence is actually punishing.
Oh, that's a good point.
Because sometimes what we think is a punishment might actually be reinforcing to someone else.
That's a fantastic point. What we think will work might not actually be effective. Data helps us objectively evaluate the impact of our interventions.
Speaking of effective interventions, I'm curious about timing. How important is it to correct the behavior immediately after it happens?
Well, it's all about that connection between the behavior and the consequence.
Okay.
The closer they are in time, the stronger the learning. If you wait too long to address a behavior, the person might not even remember what they did wrong, and the consequence loses its impact.
But in the real world, we don't always have the luxury of addressing things immediately.
Right.
What are some tips for navigating those situations where we can't provide immediate feedback?
It's a balancing act. Whenever possible, try to address the behavior as soon as you can, even if it's just a quick acknowledgement. And then you can schedule a more formal conversation later to discuss the situation in detail.
Okay, that makes sense. Finding that balance between immediacy and practicality.
Right. And remember, correcting isn't just about pointing out what someone did wrong. It's also about reinforcing the behaviors you do want to see.
This seems like a critical piece of the puzzle.
It is.
We can't just focus on decreasing unwanted behavior. We need to actively teach and reinforce the desired behavior.
Exactly.
How can we do that effectively, especially when we're also using correcting?
One effective strategy is to focus on reinforcing behaviors that are incompatible with the unwanted behavior.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're trying to reduce off-task behavior, you might reinforce on-task behavior by providing praise or small rewards when the person is focused and engaged.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different pieces fit together. We're not just trying to extinguish unwanted behavior. We're actively shaping and reinforcing the behaviors we want to see more of.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final method for decreasing unwanted behavior. Differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, or DRA. It might sound complicated, but it's actually a pretty straightforward concept.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for us. What exactly is DRA and how does it work?
With DRA, we're basically ignoring that unwanted behavior.
Okay.
And at the same time, we're showering that desired alternative behavior with tons of attention and reinforcement.
Gotcha.
It's like redirecting a river. Instead of letting it flow in the wrong direction, we're creating a new channel.
Oh, I like that. So instead of focusing all our energy on stopping the unwanted behavior, we're shifting our attention to building up that positive alternative.
Yeah.
Can you give us a real-world example of how DRA might play out?
Absolutely. Let's say you're working with a student who frequently calls out answers in class. Instead of reprimanding them every time they blurt out, you might implement a system where they earn a sticker
Okay.
for each time they raise their hand and wait to be called on.
Got it.
You're reinforcing that desired behavior
Right.
while simultaneously ignoring the calling out.
So the student is still getting that reinforcement, that attention and recognition,
Yep.
but they're learning a more appropriate way to get it.
Exactly. And one of the great things about DRA is that it can often work pretty quickly.
That's encouraging to hear. But are there any potential downsides to using DRA? Like, what should we be watching out for?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that you need to be super clear about what you're actually reinforcing.
Okay.
If you're not specific, you might accidentally reinforce a slightly different behavior that's still not quite what you want.
So it's kind of like training a dog.
Right?
If you're not consistent with your commands and your rewards, you might end up with a dog that sits, but also barks every time you ask for a paw.
That's a perfect example. Consistency is key with DRA. Okay.
You need to be clear about what you're reinforcing and deliver that reinforcement reliably every time the behavior occurs.
So we need to be precise in our definition of the desired behavior
Yeah.
and consistent with our reinforcement. Any other tips for making DRA as effective as possible?
Another important aspect of DRA is understanding the function of the unwanted behavior.
Okay.
Why is that person engaging in that behavior in the first place?
Right.
What are they getting out of it?
So it's about figuring out the why behind the behavior.
Yeah.
Is it attention seeking, escape avoidance, sensory stimulation?
Exactly. Once you understand the function,
Okay.
you can choose a more appropriate alternative behavior that serves the same purpose.
That makes so much sense. It's like figuring out the root of the problem instead of just treating the symptoms.
Precisely. And by addressing that underlying function, you're more likely to see that lasting change. This has been incredibly helpful. I'm already starting to think about how I can incorporate DRA into my own work. But what about those situations where, despite our best efforts, the unwanted behavior just keeps happening?
Right.
What happens when these strategies just aren't enough? Our source material mentions termination as a last resort.
That's a tough topic, but it's important to address. There are certain behaviors that, no matter how hard we try, might warrant those serious consequences, possibly even termination.
Unethical or illegal behavior, for example.
Exactly. Those are pretty clear-cut. It's about maintaining a safe and respectful workplace for everyone. But the source also mentions two other behaviors that, while not as straightforward, can be incredibly challenging to address.
Okay.
Lying and cheating.
I can see how those behaviors would be difficult to address from an ABA perspective.
Yeah.
It's like they throw a wrench into the whole reinforcement system.
You're absolutely right. Let's say you catch someone in a lie.
Okay.
How do you react to anything they say after that? You're
Hmm.
constantly questioning their truthfulness,
Yeah.
which makes it almost impossible to reinforce honesty effectively.
It creates this uncertainty and mistrust that can really undermine the entire therapeutic relationship.
Exactly. And in those situations, termination might be the best option,
Okay.
both for the individual and for the organization. It's like hitting the reset button, allowing both parties to move forward in a healthier way.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing when a situation has become too toxic or detrimental to continue.
But what about the situations where it's not necessarily the behavior that's the problem, but rather the fit between the individual and the work environment? Our source touches on this as another potential reason for termination.
Sometimes, despite our best efforts, the work environment just isn't the right fit for an individual's skills and needs. They might not be getting the reinforcement they need to thrive, or the demands of the job might be exceeding their capabilities.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you push, it's just not going to work. And in those cases, even if it's a difficult decision, it might be more compassionate to help that person find a different environment where they can truly succeed.
This raises an important question. How can we, as ABA professionals, contribute to creating those work environments that are more conducive to positive behavior change?
Right.
Our source material mentions progressive discipline as a common but potentially problematic approach.
Yeah. Progressive discipline is a system where consequences become increasingly severe each time a rule is broken. It starts with a verbal warning, then a written warning, and so on, eventually leading to suspension or termination.
It sounds very structured and hierarchical.
Yeah.
What are some of the potential downsides of this approach?
One major issue is that it can create an adversarial relationship between management and employees.
Okay.
It's like they're on opposite sides of a battlefield, and the focus becomes more on punishment than on problem solving.
That doesn't sound very conducive to creating a positive and supportive work environment.
Exactly. And it can also be very time-consuming and bureaucratic, bogging everyone down in paperwork and procedures.
So if progressive discipline isn't the answer,
Yeah.
what are some more effective alternatives?
Well, the methods we've been discussing, extinction, correcting, and DRA, can all be incorporated into a more positive and proactive approach to performance management. It's about focusing on prevention, early intervention, and creating a culture of support and collaboration.
Okay, so we're shifting away from that punitive mindset
Right.
toward a more constructive approach. But what does that look like in practice?
It starts with clear communication and expectations.
Okay.
Make sure everyone understands the rules, the consequences for breaking those rules, and the positive behaviors that are expected, and then be consistent in your enforcement.
So it's not about letting things slide
Right.
or making exceptions. It's about creating a predictable and fair environment.
Exactly. And it's also about providing opportunities for feedback and growth. Don't just wait until there's a problem to address it. Regularly check in with your team members, offer support, and recognize their accomplishments.
This is making me think about the importance of training and development.
Absolutely. We can't just expect people to know how to behave appropriately without providing clear guidance, training, and opportunities for practice.
It's like giving someone a new tool without explaining how to use it.
Yeah.
They might be able to figure it out eventually, but they're more likely to make mistakes and get frustrated along the way.
A perfect analogy. Training and development are essential for building that competence and confidence, and they help create a culture of continuous improvement where everyone feels supported in their growth and development.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground, from the specific techniques of extinction, correcting, and DRA to the broader considerations of creating those positive and supportive work environments. It's clear that we, as ABA professionals, have a vital role to play in shaping that environment.
It's a responsibility and a privilege. We have the knowledge and the skills to make a real difference in people's lives.
And it all starts with understanding behavior, recognizing the factors that influence it, and using that knowledge to create positive change.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of decreasing unwanted behavior.
Of course.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical takeaways. Remember, it's all about understanding behavior, shaping it ethically and effectively, and ultimately improving lives.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Right.
We encourage you to continue exploring these topics on the ABA Chapter Chat Forum. Share your experiences, ask questions, and let's learn from each other.
Until next time, keep diving deep
Yeah.
and keep the conversation going.